Hello, my name is Dr. Yaya Sissoko. Today we are going to talk about Chapter 4, the market forces of supply and demand. So, market competition. So, what is a market competition? Economists use the model of supply and demand to analyze competitive market. In a competitive market, there are many buyers and sellers, each of whom has little or no influence on the market price. What is supply and demand? Supply and demand are words that economists use most often. It's the forces that make market economies work. So supply and demand also refer to the behavior of people as they interact with one another in competitive market. One example of competitive market could be the market of clothing, the market of food, where you have many buyer and many seller, for instance. What is a market? A market is a group of buyer and seller of a particular good or service. One example of market for good is the market for cars, or the market for food. One example of services is the market of education. Buyer as a group determine the demand for the product. Buyers are also called household or consumer. In the example of market for car, the buyer are people buying the car. In the example for market for food, the buyer are people buying the food. In the example for education, the buyer are the student enrolling in school. Seller, on the other hand, as a group determine the supply of the product. Sellers are also called producer or supplier. In the market for automobile, the seller are the automaker, the automobile makers such as General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Honda, Volkswagen, or Toyota. In the market of food, the seller are the farmer providing the food to the store. In the market of education, the seller are the school or university providing the education to the student. Market take many forms. Market can be highly organized. So, for instance, market for agricultural commodity are very organized. They can also be less organized. For instance, market for ice cream in a particular town are not very organized. What are the characteristics of a competitive market? Competitive market are market where there are many buyer and seller. Each of them has a negligible impact on the price of the product. Usually in a competitive market, buyer and seller take the price as given. They don't have a power to change the price of the product. Price, and quantity are determined by all buyer and seller as they interact in the marketplace. Perfectly competitive markets are markets where goods offered for sale are exactly the same. There are many buyers and sellers so that no single buyer or seller has an influence over the market price. Buyer and seller are considered as price taker. They take the price as given. This means that if a buyer want to undercut the price of the seller can refuse to sell to that buyer and wait for the next buyer who will buy at the market price. If on the other hand, if a seller try to overcharge a buyer, the buyer can just move to the next seller and buy it at the market price. So both buyer and seller take the price as given. We call them price taker. Therefore, at the market price, buyer can buy all they want, seller can sell all they want. Not all the goods are sold in a perfectly competitive market. In a market where there is only one seller, we call that monopoly. Monopoly set its own price. We call monopoly a price maker. One example of monopoly is U.S. Post Office. Another example of monopoly is drug company. Another example of monopoly is utility company such as electricity or gas company. Microsoft Windows is another example of monopoly. Other markets are in between perfect competition and monopoly. So we have oligopoly and monopolistic competition. Oligopoly, in oligopoly, you have a few sellers between 2 and 9 sellers. And one example of oligopoly would be, for instance, a mall in the town. You have 2 malls in the town, or gas station, 5 gas stations in the town, or dry cleaner, so 3 dry cleaner in town. Example of monopolistic competition, you have about 50 to close to 100 sellers. One example would be, for instance, of monopolistic competition, fast food restaurant in the USA. We'll talk more about, so monopoly, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition in chapter 14, 15, 16, and 17.